Wife filed for divorce on our anniversary. Turns out she forgot I'm a lawyer and know all her dirty secrets. What happened next will shock you, but first let me tell you how this nightmare started. 10 years. 10 whole years of marriage, and she chose our anniversary to serve me with divorce papers. I was sitting in our favorite restaurant, the same booth where we had our first date, holding a small velvet box with the diamond earrings I'd saved up for months to buy. The waiter had just brought out the champagne when she slid those papers across the table like she was ordering dessert. My hands were shaking as I opened the folder. The grounds for divorce were listed as irreconcilable differences, but what really caught my attention was the property division she was requesting. She wanted the house, both cars, half my retirement fund, and alimony for 5 years. The woman who hadn't worked a full-time job in 3 years was asking for enough money to live comfortably while I started over from scratch. But here's the thing she seemed to forget in her rush to end our marriage. I spent the last 8 years working in family law. I knew every trick, every loophole, every way someone could try to hide assets or manipulate the system. And more importantly, I knew exactly what kind of evidence would hold up in court. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the entire day going through our financial records. What I found made my stomach turn. She'd been planning this for at least 6 months, maybe longer. There were credit card statements I'd never seen, showing thousands of dollars in charges to high-end boutiques, expensive restaurants, and hotels. But the most damaging evidence was hidden in her email account. The password she'd used for everything was still our wedding date, which would have been sweet if she hadn't been using it to coordinate her affair. The emails told the whole story. She'd been seeing someone from her yoga class for over a year. They'd been meeting at hotels, taking weekend trips while I thought she was visiting her sister and making plans for their future together. But the real kicker was discovering that her new boyfriend was married too, and his wife had no idea what was happening. I printed everything. Every email, every receipt, every piece of evidence that showed she'd been living a double life while I worked 60-hour weeks to support us. The woman who cried about our tight budget had been spending money like water on her secret relationship. The same woman who claimed we'd grown apart had been actively planning her exit strategy while I was planning surprise dinners and anniversary gifts. That night, she came home acting like nothing had happened. She asked about my day, complained about traffic, and even suggested we order pizza from our usual place. I sat there watching her perform this act of normalcy while knowing she'd spent the afternoon texting her boyfriend about apartment hunting. The level of deception was almost impressive in its thoroughness. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my home office, organizing evidence and researching precedents for similar cases. By morning, I had a strategy that would not only protect my assets but potentially expose her lover's situation to his unsuspecting wife. It wasn't about revenge, it was about justice and making sure the truth came out. The following week, her lawyer contacted me to discuss settlement terms. He was probably expecting me to roll over and accept whatever she was offering, assuming I'd be too emotional to think clearly. Instead, I showed up to that meeting with 3 binders full of documentation and a counteroffer that left both of them speechless. I wasn't asking for alimony or trying to take everything she owned. I simply wanted to keep what I'd earned and worked for while making sure she understood that adultery and financial deception have consequences. The look on her face when her lawyer explained that I had grounds for a fault-based divorce was something I'll never forget. All the confidence she'd shown when serving me papers completely evaporated. Update 1. The tables turned completely. 2 weeks after that initial meeting, things took a turn I never could have predicted. Her boyfriend's wife reached out to me directly. Apparently, she'd been doing her own detective work and found some of the same evidence I'd uncovered. She wanted to meet, and what she told me changed everything about how I was handling the situation. It turns out my wife wasn't the only one being deceived. Her boyfriend had been telling her that his marriage was over, that he was just waiting for the right time to file for divorce, and that they'd be together as soon as both situations were resolved. Meanwhile, he was telling his wife that he was working late and attending business conferences. The web of lies was even more complicated than I'd realized. But here's where it gets really interesting. His wife worked in forensic accounting. She'd been tracking their finances and discovered that he'd been funneling money into a separate account for months. Money that was supposed to be going toward their mortgage and their kids' college funds was instead being used to finance his affair with my wife. We're talking about tens of thousands of dollars that he'd essentially stolen from his own family. We decided to work together, sharing information and coordinating our legal strategies. It felt strange at first, bonding with someone over our shared betrayal, but she was incredibly smart and had insights I wouldn't have considered. She also had access to financial records that painted an even clearer picture of how long this affair had been going on and how much money had been involved. The four of us ended up in mediation together, which was as awkward as it sounds. Watching my wife and her boyfriend try to maintain their composure while their entire scheme unraveled was almost surreal. They'd been so careful about hiding their relationship from their respective spouses, but they'd been sloppy about covering their financial tracks. My wife's lawyer tried to argue that her relationship started after our marriage had already ended emotionally, but the evidence showed clearly that she'd been planning her exit strategy while still accepting gifts from me, taking vacations together, and even discussing renewing our wedding vows. The timeline didn't support her version of events, and her boyfriend's financial records proved that they'd been serious about their future together for much longer than she wanted to admit. During one particularly tense session, her boyfriend actually tried to throw her under the bus, claiming that she'd been the one pushing for him to leave his wife and that he'd never intended for things to go so far. The betrayal on her face was immediate and complete. She realized that the man she'd destroyed her marriage for was willing to sacrifice her to save himself. That's when she made her first major mistake. She got angry and started telling the truth about their relationship, including details about how they'd been planning to move in together and how he'd promised to support her financially once both divorces were finalized. Every word she spoke was creating more evidence against herself, and her lawyer was frantically trying to get her to stop talking. The mediation ended with no agreement, which meant we were headed to court. But something had shifted in the dynamic between my wife and her boyfriend. The trust was broken, and they were no longer presenting a united front. His wife and I, on the other hand, had developed a solid working relationship based on shared goals and mutual respect for the truth. That night, I got a call from my wife. She was crying and asking if we could talk privately without lawyers present. She wanted to meet at a coffee shop downtown, somewhere neutral where we could have an honest conversation about everything that had happened. Against my better judgment, I agreed. Update 2, the shocking truth comes out. The coffee shop meeting was supposed to be a simple conversation, but what my wife told me that day completely changed my understanding of the entire situation. She wasn't just having an affair, she was being blackmailed, and the whole divorce was part of an elaborate scheme that went way deeper than I could have imagined. It started with her admitting that yes, she'd been seeing this man from her yoga class, but the relationship wasn't what it appeared to be. According to her, it had begun as a casual friendship that gradually became more intimate, but things had taken a dark turn several months ago when he started demanding more control over her life and finances. She explained that he'd been recording their conversations and taking photos during their intimate moments without her knowledge. When she tried to end the relationship, he threatened to send everything to me, to her family, and to post it all online unless she continued seeing him and helped him access our joint accounts. The expensive purchases I'd found weren't gifts to herself, they were items he demanded she buy for him or his wife. But here's where the story gets really twisted. The man's wife, the forensic accountant who'd been so helpful in building our case, wasn't an innocent victim discovering her husband's affair. She was his partner in the entire scheme. They'd been targeting couples for years, with him initiating affairs while she used her professional skills to identify and access their financial assets. My wife showed me text messages that painted a completely different picture of what had been happening. Messages where he threatened to ruin her reputation and destroy our marriage if she didn't comply with increasingly demanding requests. Messages where his wife provided detailed instructions on how to access specific accounts and transfer money without triggering automatic alerts. The yoga class where they'd supposedly met wasn't a coincidence either. They'd researched the members, identified the women who were married to professionals with substantial assets, and systematically targeted them. My wife wasn't their first victim, and according to the messages she showed me, she wasn't going to be their last. The divorce papers hadn't been her idea. They'd forced her to file, threatening to expose everything if she didn't follow their timeline exactly. The property division she'd requested wasn't for her benefit, it was designed to give them access to assets they could then manipulate or steal. Even the affair itself had been orchestrated to create the emotional leverage they needed to control her completely. I sat in that coffee shop, staring at message after message that revealed the depth of this deception, feeling like I was reading a crime novel instead of my own life story. The woman I'd been married to for 10 years had been living in fear for months, trapped in a situation she couldn't escape without destroying everything we'd built together. But the most shocking revelation was still coming. She told me that his wife had approached me not to seek justice for her own betrayal, but to get closer to our case and monitor how much evidence I was gathering. Every piece of information I'd shared with her had been reported back to them, and they'd been adjusting their strategy accordingly. The financial records she'd provided weren't evidence of her husband's crimes. They were carefully crafted documents designed to support their version of events while hiding the true scope of their operation. The forensic accounting skills I'd been so impressed with were being used to cover their tracks and manipulate the evidence in ways I couldn't detect. My wife broke down completely as she explained how trapped she'd felt, watching me work so hard to build a case against her while knowing that I was actually fighting against professional criminals who were several steps ahead of us. She'd wanted to tell me the truth dozens of times, but every attempt had been met with new threats and evidence of what they were capable of doing to people who crossed them. The coffee shop conversation lasted for 3 hours, with her showing me evidence of their scheme that I never would have found on my own. Bank account information, communication with other victims, and detailed plans for how they intended to disappear once they'd extracted everything they could from our situation. By the time we left that coffee shop, I realized that everything I thought I knew about the past year had been completely wrong. My wife wasn't a cheating spouse planning to leave me for her lover. She was a victim of an elaborate con game that had spiraled far beyond what anyone could have predicted. That night, we sat in our living room and planned our next move. Not as a divorcing couple, but as partners working together to expose a criminal operation and protect other potential victims from going through what we'd experienced. Final update: justice served and marriage saved. The next few weeks were like something out of a crime drama, but instead of watching it on television, we were living it. Working with law enforcement to build a case against professional con artists while trying to save our marriage and protect other victims required a level of coordination and trust that I wasn't sure we could manage. The first step was gathering evidence without alerting them to what we were doing. My wife continued to play her role, meeting with her supposed boyfriend and his wife while secretly recording conversations and documenting their demands. Meanwhile, I worked with a detective who specialized in financial crimes to trace their previous victims and build a comprehensive case. What we discovered was terrifying. They'd been running this operation for at least 5 years, targeting at least 12 other couples that we could identify. The pattern was always the same. He would initiate an affair while she used her professional skills to identify and access assets. Some victims had lost their entire savings, others had been bankrupted by legal fees fighting divorces they never wanted. The most heartbreaking part was talking to their previous victims. One woman had lost her house and custody of her children because she couldn't prove that her husband's affair had been orchestrated. Another couple had divorced and spent years fighting over assets that had been systematically stolen during the legal proceedings. These weren't just financial crimes, they were destroying families and ruining lives. But gathering evidence against professionals who specialized in manipulation and deception was incredibly difficult. They'd covered their tracks carefully, using cash transactions, temporary accounts, and communication methods that were hard to trace. Every conversation was calculated, every demand was phrased in ways that could be interpreted as consensual if taken out of context. The breakthrough came when my wife managed to record a conversation where they explicitly discussed their next targets and the specific techniques they'd used to manipulate previous victims. In that recording, they laid out their entire operation, including how they'd identify potential victims, initiate contact, build trust, and then systematically extract assets while destroying marriages. But the most damaging evidence was their discussion of what they called their insurance policy. They kept detailed records of their victims, including intimate photos and recordings, which they used to ensure compliance and prevent anyone from coming forward. This wasn't just fraud, it was blackmail, extortion, and a dozen other serious crimes. When law enforcement finally moved to arrest them, the scale of their operation became clear. They had files on over 30 potential victims, detailed financial information on dozens of families, and evidence of crimes going back nearly a decade. The investigation expanded to include multiple jurisdictions as they discovered victims in several different states. The legal proceedings were complex and emotionally draining, but seeing them in court, stripped of their manipulative charm and facing serious criminal charges, was incredibly satisfying. My wife testified about the months of threats and coercion she'd endured, while other victims shared their stories of financial ruin and family destruction. During the trial, we learned that they'd specifically targeted my wife because of my legal background. They'd assumed that having a lawyer involved would make their scheme more credible and provide better access to substantial assets. The irony was that my legal training was ultimately what helped expose their operation and bring them to justice. The sentencing hearing was emotional for everyone involved. Victim after victim stood up to describe how these criminals had destroyed their lives, stolen their savings, and torn apart their families. The judge sentenced them to substantial prison terms and ordered restitution for all identified victims, though the financial damage was so extensive that most people would never recover completely. But the most important outcome wasn't the criminal conviction, it was what happened to our marriage. Going through this experience together, working as partners to expose the truth and protect other families, had created a bond between us that was stronger than what we'd started with. We'd learned to communicate honestly, trust each other completely, and work together toward common goals. The process of rebuilding our relationship wasn't simple or quick. We had to work through the pain of those months when I thought she was betraying me, and she had to heal from the trauma of being manipulated and controlled by criminals. But every conversation brought us closer together, and every shared victory in the legal case reinforced our partnership. We never did get divorced. Instead, we renewed our wedding vows on the anniversary of the day she'd originally served me with papers. This time, there were no secrets, no hidden agendas, and no threats hanging over our heads. Just two people who'd been through something terrible together and come out stronger on the other side. The experience taught us both that marriage isn't just about love and compatibility, it's about trust, communication, and the willingness to fight for each other when things get difficult. We'd been tested in ways that most couples never face, and we'd passed that test by choosing to work together instead of giving up on each other. Looking back, I realized that if she'd come to me immediately when the blackmail started, we could have avoided months of pain and suspicion. But I also understand why she felt trapped and alone, facing threats that seemed impossible to overcome. The important thing is that we eventually found our way back to each other and used our experience to help other people avoid similar situations. These days, we work together on cases involving financial fraud and family manipulation. My legal background combined with her first-hand experience as a victim makes us an effective team in helping other families navigate similar situations. It's given new meaning to our marriage and our professional lives, turning our worst experience into a way to help other people. The criminals who tried to destroy our marriage ended up making it stronger than ever. They're spending years in prison while we're building a life together that's based on complete honesty and mutual support. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well, and we're living better than ever.